When Vincent Moreau's new secretary spilled coffee on his desk, he noticed more than the stain. A bruise, faint but unmistakable, wrapped around her wrist and neck, like a warning she couldn't speak aloud. She tried to hide it with a nervous smile, but Vincent wasn't the kind of man who missed details. For years he'd ruled his empire from behind polished glass and quiet power. But that morning, in his high-rise office overlooking downtown Chicago, something shifted. The moment he saw those bruises, the city's underworld just gained a new enemy. Vincent Moreau began his day before sunrise, sitting in his penthouse office high above downtown Chicago. The city below was still half asleep, but his work never stopped. He moved through reports and phone logs like a man reading a familiar map. His empire was built on order, precision, and silence. Every deal, every favor, every secret came through him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. People feared what they couldn't predict, and Vincent had mastered unpredictability. Yet that morning, something would happen that not even he had planned for. The sound of footsteps broke the stillness of the room. Emily Carter, his new secretary, entered quietly with his morning coffee. She always moved carefully, almost rehearsed, as if afraid of taking up too much space. Her voice was polite, calm, never too loud. Vincent had noticed that about her since the first week she started. She never complained, never spoke unless asked, just worked, efficient, invisible. Today, though, her hands were shaking slightly as she set the cup down. He caught the small tremor instantly, like a shift in the wind before a storm. Vincent's eyes caught something unusual. Emily's sleeves were pulled far down, almost to her knuckles, despite the warmth of the room. The gesture was odd. She had always dressed neatly, precisely, but this was different. It wasn't style, it was defense. As she turned to leave, the sleeve slipped for a second, revealing dark purple marks circling her wrist. They weren't light bruises from bumping something. They were deep, deliberate, finger-shaped. Vincent said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes narrowed slightly as she hurried from the room, pretending not to notice what he'd seen. For a long moment, Vincent didn't move. He stared at the empty doorway, the untouched cup of coffee still steaming on his desk. His mind replayed the brief moment again and again. The bruises weren't random. They told a story without words, one he'd seen before in other lives, other faces. Fear leaves marks that can't be hidden forever. He leaned back in his chair thinking, the last person who hurt someone under his roof hadn't walked away free. This would be no different. He pressed a button on his desk phone and called for Mrs. Lane. Mrs. Lane had been with him for over 20 years. She knew his moods, his habits, his unspoken commands. When she stepped into the office, she found him staring out the window, his reflection sharp in the glass. He asked about Emily. Mrs. Lane spoke softly, explaining that Emily had been through a divorce not long ago. She was trying to start over, living with her sister, taking extra hours to make ends meet. Vincent listened without interruption. He knew pain when he heard it hidden between words. Divorce, fear, someone had followed her out of that past. Vincent asked if Emily had mentioned anyone bothering her. Mrs. Lane shook her head, unsure. He dismissed her with a quiet nod, but his mind was already racing. People often lied about being fine because they didn't believe anyone could protect them. He understood that. The world only respected power. Without it, even justice became a suggestion. He picked up his phone again and called his head of security, Marco Russo. There were no raised voices, no explanations. Just one simple instruction: find out who Emily Carter went home to every night, and if anyone was watching her. Marco was good at his job. By the time most of Chicago was on its first cup of coffee, he already had eyes on the problem. Vincent spent the day pretending to focus on business, but his thoughts never left that image of bruised wrists and trembling hands. He had seen fear before, but this was personal now. Emily worked under his roof, in his office, in his protection. If someone had touched her, it meant someone had crossed into his territory. In Vincent's world, that was a mistake people didn't get to make twice. Late that evening, Marco returned with information. Emily lived in a modest apartment on the west side with her sister Anna. She kept a quiet life, rarely went out, and took the same bus to and from work every day. But what caught Marco's attention wasn't her routine. It was the blue sedan that always appeared a few blocks behind her route. The same car, same driver, 3 nights in a row. Marco had pulled the plate number already. Vincent knew without asking that whoever drove that car was the reason Emily's hands shook that morning. Vincent walked to the tall windows of his office, the city lights stretching below like veins of fire. He stood there for a long time, silent. When he finally spoke, it was only to himself. There was always someone who thought power meant cruelty, that strength gave permission to hurt the helpless. He had seen it in boardrooms, in backrooms, in his own family. He had built an empire on control, but there were still things that could pull him into action. This wasn't business anymore. This was principle. Emily Carter would never be hurt again. Marco returned the next morning with a file. Inside were photos of the car and its driver, a police officer named Daniel Hughes. Vincent scanned the pages without surprise. An officer. That explained everything. The confidence, the stalking, the untouchable arrogance. Marco reported that Hughes was Emily's ex-husband, recently divorced after several domestic incidents that had gone nowhere. Each report had vanished through administrative errors. Vincent didn't need to hear more. He had dealt with corrupt men before, but one wearing a badge was something different. It wasn't just corruption, it was rot hiding behind a uniform. Vincent dismissed Marco but kept the file open on his desk. He studied Hughes's photograph. A confident grin, proud posture, eyes that gave away too much. This was a man who believed he could get away with anything. Vincent had dealt with that kind of man his entire life. The difference was, he always made sure they didn't keep believing it for long. He opened his calendar, cleared his next 2 days of meetings, and told his assistant to hold all calls. This wasn't a favor or a business move. It was something closer to justice. That afternoon, Mrs. Lane mentioned that Emily had been quiet all day. She had been seen crying in the staff hallway, but insisted she was fine. Vincent didn't approach her. He knew too much attention too soon could push her deeper into silence. Instead, he instructed Mrs. Lane to treat her gently and watch for signs of contact from the outside. Every move had to be deliberate. He needed Emily to feel safe without knowing why. At the same time, he needed Daniel Hughes to start feeling watched. Fear was a language Vincent spoke fluently. By evening, Marco had men following Hughes discreetly. They tracked his movements after work, watched him drink with other officers, and noted his route home. Everything looked normal on the surface, but the tension underneath was obvious. Hughes was careful, too careful. He checked his mirrors often, looked over his shoulder when walking to his car. It was a man's instinct when he knew he'd done something that might come back to him. Vincent didn't need to move fast. He preferred his enemies to sense something coming before it arrived. It made the fall more satisfying. The next morning, Vincent received another update. Hughes had spent the night parked outside Emily's apartment, engine running for hours. He hadn't approached her, hadn't knocked, just waited and watched. The kind of control that wasn't physical but psychological. Vincent felt the same cold anger that had built the foundations of his power. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he simply closed the folder, picked up his phone, and gave Marco one new order: track everything. Every stop, every conversation, every face Hughes met. Nothing about this man would stay hidden after today. As the day ended, Vincent stood once again by his window, the skyline bathed in the fading gold of sunset. Somewhere out there, Emily Carter was cleaning her small kitchen, trying to forget the man who used to control her life. Somewhere else, Daniel Hughes was sitting in his car, confident that nobody could touch him because he carried a badge. But what he didn't know was that the city had shifted. Vincent Moreau had noticed him, and in Chicago that was the beginning of the end. The war for one woman's safety had just begun. The next morning began with gray clouds over the city. Vincent arrived earlier than usual, his thoughts already fixed on Emily's situation. He reviewed the surveillance logs Marco had delivered overnight. Every entry was neat, detailed, and grimly repetitive. Hughes' car had been spotted again outside Emily's building. He stayed for hours, then drove away before dawn. Vincent's expression never changed, but his silence told the story. He had spent his life watching predators hide behind rules. Now he was about to show what happened when those rules no longer protected them. Marco arrived mid-morning, carrying another folder. Inside were photos of Hughes talking with 2 other officers in a downtown bar. They laughed, drinking, unaware of the camera watching them. Marco mentioned both men had disciplinary warnings in their files. It wasn't proof, but it painted a clear picture. The corruption wasn't isolated, it was a circle. Vincent's gaze lingered on the photos. A man who could hurt a woman and still smile afterward was dangerous in ways most people never understood. He decided he would dismantle every layer of protection Hughes had, one piece at a time. Emily came into the office just before lunch, quiet as always. Her hair was tied neatly, her sleeves long again. Vincent noticed the tiredness behind her polite expression. He didn't speak to her about the bruises or the car outside her home. He simply thanked her for her work and watched as she arranged papers carefully on his desk. Her hands moved quickly, but her eyes avoided his completely. Fear had a way of making people invisible to themselves. Vincent understood that too well. The more she tried to disappear, the more determined he became to protect her. That afternoon, Mrs. Lane brought word that Emily had declined to take her usual lunch break. She was sitting in the staff lounge, staring at her phone. Vincent instructed Mrs. Lane to stay nearby without asking questions. He knew that direct intervention too soon could backfire. Fear made people unpredictable. He needed Emily calm, stable, and safe. His role wasn't to comfort her. It was to make sure no one ever hurt her again. As the hours passed, Vincent reviewed the city's maps, marking patterns where Hughes's car had been seen. Each mark brought the hunt closer. That evening, Vincent's office was dark, except for the glow of city lights outside. He looked out over the skyline, feeling the weight of his own silence. The world outside was filled with noise, sirens, deals, distractions, but his power lived in quiet decisions. He thought about the way Emily had avoided his eyes, about those bruises hidden under fabric. The decision was already made. Before we continue, Vincent's quiet plan was about to turn into something much larger. If you're watching, take a second to subscribe. The story is only getting started, and the war hasn't even begun. The following morning, Vincent arrived to find Marco already waiting. He had gathered the first week of surveillance results. Every evening, Hughes followed the same pattern, parking near Emily's building, staying for hours, then leaving. His behavior was escalating. He was testing boundaries. Vincent understood that pattern too well. It always ended with confrontation. Marco mentioned Hughes had friends on the force, who might warn him if anyone filed a complaint. Vincent saw the danger clearly. If the police wouldn't protect her, then he would. But his justice would come from outside their walls, fast and final. By noon, Vincent received another update. Marco's team had traced Hughes's movements to a bar frequented by off-duty officers. He was seen bragging about his control over his ex-wife, calling her fragile, broken. The words angered Vincent, though his face remained unreadable. Marco added that Hughes's spending didn't match his salary. New car, expensive watch, regular high-end dinners. It meant money was coming from somewhere else, somewhere illegal. Vincent made a note in his book. Power built on fear never lasted long, not when someone like him decided to take it apart piece by piece. Vincent spent the afternoon pacing slowly through his office. He thought of the system that allowed men like Hughes to thrive. Laws protected them. Reputation shielded them. The badge was their armor, but armor could crack. He would make sure it did. Marco asked if Vincent wanted him to confront Hughes directly, but the answer was clear. No threats. No warnings, only evidence. Once the truth came out, it would crush him faster than bullets ever could. Vincent was patient. He had waited years for enemies to fall. Hughes would be no different. His time was coming. Emily's days went on quietly. She kept her head down, completing her tasks with mechanical focus. She thanked Mrs. Lane for kindness she couldn't explain. At night, she still saw the same car near her building. She didn't tell anyone, afraid of losing her job or drawing attention. Her fear was understandable. Men like Hughes made sure their victims doubted everything, even safety. Meanwhile, Vincent had already placed cameras near her block. He watched the footage each evening. The sight of Hughes idling in the dark, staring at her window, deepened his resolve to destroy him completely. 3 nights later, Marco brought footage to the office. Hughes had stepped out of the car and grabbed Emily's arm as she left her building. The video showed her trying to pull away, shaking her head, clearly terrified. Hughes held her just long enough to leave marks again, before walking off. Vincent replayed the footage in silence. The image burned into his mind. He had proof now, enough to act. He ordered Marco to secure every copy and back it up off-site. Hughes had crossed the line from arrogance to obsession, and that made him a target. Marco continued digging into Hughes's background. He found 2 complaints filed against him years ago for excessive force during arrests. Both were dismissed by internal affairs. Vincent understood what that meant. Friends in high places, the uncle, Deputy Chief Patrick Hughes, had likely protected him for years. The pattern was clear: power protecting power. Vincent wasn't surprised. He'd built his own empire on similar loyalty, but unlike the police, his loyalty didn't cover monsters. He decided the only way to win this battle was to use the same structure against them. Corruption could destroy itself when exposed. The next morning, Vincent met with Frank Donati, his longtime advisor and closest confidant. Frank listened as Vincent laid out everything. The bruises, the car, the surveillance footage. Frank knew the risks. Taking on a cop with connections was dangerous. It could bring heat to their businesses, investigations, exposure, but Vincent didn't care. Some lines, once crossed, demanded action. Frank agreed to help, but advised caution. They wouldn't attack physically. They would ruin Hughes socially, financially, and politically. It would take time, but once started, it couldn't be stopped. Vincent nodded. Patience had always been his sharpest weapon. Frank proposed a simple start: follow the money. Most corrupt men eventually got careless with cash. Marco's team began tracing Hughes's accounts. Within days they found thousands of dollars in irregular deposits, all in cash. Vincent reviewed the records personally. The pattern was obvious. Bribes, payoffs, street-level extortion disguised as traffic fines. He ordered Marco to gather proof quietly, no leaks yet. This wasn't just about protecting Emily anymore. This was about principle. A predator in uniform had built his life on fear. Vincent would strip him of every illusion of power until all that remained was guilt. Emily noticed small changes around her workplace. Security staff seemed more alert. The drivers who took her home changed routes often. She didn't understand why, but she felt slightly safer without knowing the reason. Vincent made sure she never saw the growing operation around her. Every camera installed, every man positioned, was part of a silent network to keep her out of harm's reach. He'd learned long ago that protection was most effective when it didn't feel like a cage. Emily just needed peace. Hughes, on the other hand, needed to feel the walls closing in. By the end of the week, Marco had compiled a full report. Hughes was spending more than he earned, meeting known criminals, and involved in side deals that looked like payoffs. Frank reviewed it and said they had enough to leak pieces of it. Vincent didn't rush. Timing mattered. He wanted Hughes to start noticing his own isolation before the storm hit. Vincent's revenge was never loud. It was methodical. Every action would seem natural until the target realized the city itself had turned against him, and by then no one would come to save him. Vincent sat alone, late at night, going through the reports again. The more he read, the clearer it became that Hughes wasn't just corrupt, he was careful. He surrounded himself with loyal officers who'd look the other way. It reminded Vincent of the code his own men lived by. But there was a difference. His loyalty was earned. Hughes was bought. Vincent knew loyalty built on money collapsed as soon as fear shifted sides. He planned to make every person around Hughes realize that staying close to him was no longer safe. Fear could be a powerful persuader. The next morning, Vincent's first call went to Marco. He ordered discreet surveillance not just on Hughes but also on his associates. Bank accounts, night habits, phone calls, all monitored. Marco's men moved like ghosts. Within hours they had details on Hughes's partner, another officer with gambling debts. That weakness could become useful later. Vincent noted it carefully. He wanted Hughes's entire support network to crumble one person at a time. In his experience, powerful men rarely fell because of force. They fell because their friends turned away when loyalty became too costly to maintain. Meanwhile, Emily continued working quietly, unaware of the storm building around her name. She spent her evenings writing resumes, hoping to find another job outside the city. Her exhaustion showed in the slow movements of her hands and the dark circles under her eyes. "Is Mrs. Lane noticed and kept checking in. Vincent observed from a distance, never interfering directly. He knew she didn't trust easily, and trust couldn't be bought. It had to be earned. Protecting her without her knowing became his quiet promise. He would end this before she ever had to ask for help again. Late that night, Marco showed Vincent a new set of recordings. Hughes's car appeared outside Emily's building again. Headlights off, engine running. After 30 minutes he stepped out, walked to her door, then turned back when he noticed movement nearby. The man was escalating but still cautious. Vincent could almost feel the tension rising. He ordered Marco to double the surveillance around her block and prepare hidden cameras with better resolution. If Hughes made another move, there would be no doubt left. Vincent didn't rush anger. He let it mature until it became precision. The following morning, Frank returned to discuss strategy. He recommended leaking small pieces of information to internal affairs anonymously. A whisper here, a rumor there, just enough to create suspicion. Once the department turned its attention inward, Hughes would lose protection. Vincent approved. Within days, quiet rumors began circulating inside the police network. Officers avoided Hughes at the bar. Some stopped returning his calls. isolation started to take shape. Vincent didn't need to touch him to make him fall. All he had to do was show people who he really was, and the system would eat its own. As whispers grew, Marco's men noticed Hughes acting differently. He looked restless, glancing over his shoulder at random times. He stayed home longer, skipped shifts, and ignored calls from colleagues. The calm confidence he once carried was fading. Vincent watched him unravel with a steady hand. Fear worked best when it came quietly, without visible threats. He told Marco to keep him cornered but untouched. Let the pressure build naturally. Hughes would destroy himself trying to figure out who was pulling the strings. That confusion was worth more than any bullet or threat. By the third week, Hughes was drinking heavily. Marco captured footage of him arguing with his partner outside a bar, shouting about someone ruining his career. The partner tried to calm him down, but Hughes shoved him. The next morning, the incident reached internal affairs through an anonymous email. Vincent read the report and smiled slightly. The cracks were now visible to everyone. Men like Hughes always blamed others when their control slipped. He wouldn't stop until he found someone to punish. Vincent made sure that when he finally looked for a target, every road led to him. At the office, Emily began noticing fewer calls from her ex-husband. The silence unsettled her at first. She didn't trust it. Victims of long fear never believed peace was real. Mrs. Lane encouraged her to rest, to eat, to focus on her work. Vincent observed quietly as her posture began to change. Her movements grew less tense. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was the beginning of it. Outside the walls of that calm office, a quiet war was unfolding, and she remained unaware that she was the reason powerful men were starting to panic. Frank met with Vincent again to review progress. Internal Affairs had officially opened a preliminary inquiry into Hughes's finances. It was a small step but a critical one. Once that door opened, it wouldn't close easily. Vincent ordered Marco to keep collecting data. Every transaction, every meeting, every side deal. The truth was building like a tidal wave, and soon nothing could stop it. Frank reminded him to stay cautious. Retaliation was inevitable. Vincent agreed, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking of risk. He was thinking of Emily finally walking home without looking over her shoulder. By now, Hughes had noticed the shift completely. His friends were distant. His partner avoided him. His boss had started watching him more closely. He felt hunted, though he didn't know by whom. The paranoia grew daily. He began calling Emily again, leaving voicemails that started calm and ended with anger. Vincent heard them all. Marco had tapped the line, recording every word. The evidence was enough to ruin Hughes permanently. But Vincent wasn't finished yet. Exposure alone wasn't enough. He wanted Hughes to feel the same helpless fear he had given Emily before the end came. Vincent's office lights stayed on late into the night. The city outside was quiet, but inside those walls, every decision carried weight. Marco had returned with fresh evidence, photos, statements, and bank logs connecting Hughes to a known loan shark. It was the kind of proof that couldn't be buried. Vincent didn't react immediately. He flipped through each page slowly, memorizing every detail. Patience was his weapon. The goal wasn't to rush the downfall. It was to make Hughes's world collapse piece by piece until there was nowhere left for him to hide, not even behind a badge. Emily continued her routine, unaware that her boss was dismantling her abuser's life from afar. Each morning, she brought Vincent his coffee, her tone polite but still distant. He never asked personal questions, never hinted at what he knew. She had no reason to suspect that the quiet man behind the desk was orchestrating an invisible war for her safety. That was how Vincent preferred it. True protection didn't need acknowledgement, it only needed results. And soon she would notice the silence, the absence of fear. That would be her only clue that something had changed forever. The following day, Marco delivered a recording of Hughes meeting a local gang member in a dark parking lot. The conversation was brief but incriminating. Cash exchanged hands. Vincent leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. He didn't need to know the deal's details. The footage itself was enough. Marco suggested sending it to the press, but Vincent refused. Not yet. The timing wasn't right. When the story broke, it had to hit every angle at once, financial, moral, personal. Only then would it destroy him completely. The first strike would be public, the last one personal. Frank reviewed the footage with Vincent later that evening. He agreed it was strong evidence but warned that leaks could backfire if traced. Vincent knew that. Everything they did had to appear organic, like a system turning on itself. He planned a slow build of tension within the department. Rumors, documents, whispers, all leading to Hughes. Frank admired his precision but questioned the risk. Vincent didn't answer directly. He simply said that if a man like Hughes could destroy someone's life unchecked, then his own empire meant nothing. There were battles worth fighting, and this was one of them. Marco's men expanded surveillance, gathering proof of Hughes's network. They found several unreported cash exchanges, each involving drivers paying to avoid citations. Vincent smiled faintly at the irony, a cop extorting citizens while pretending to serve justice. Now the tables would turn. Marco suggested planting a few quiet leaks through independent journalists. Vincent approved only one, carefully worded, hinting at a growing corruption scandal within the police department. The story didn't name Hughes, but it placed a target squarely on his back. Within hours, whispers began spreading across precincts. Suspicion once started was impossible to contain. At home, Hughes started noticing the shift. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. The department buzzed with quiet rumors. He didn't know who started them, only that they felt personal. His frustration grew into anger. He snapped at his partner, accused others of betrayal, and began drinking more. Marco's updates detailed every move. Vincent read them carefully, satisfied with the pattern unfolding. Paranoia would break Hughes faster than any bullet. A man used to control couldn't handle uncertainty. Every moment he spent looking over his shoulder would eat away at his confidence. Internal Affairs received an anonymous envelope the following week. Inside were photocopies of financial transactions and still images of Hughes taking money. The source was untraceable. Vincent's team made sure of that. The evidence was enough to open an inquiry, but not enough to make arrests. That was intentional. The goal wasn't immediate justice, it was pressure, the kind that made people sweat, lie, and expose themselves further. Vincent understood the psychology of guilt. When the walls started closing in, men like Hughes didn't stand still. They dug their own graves trying to escape. The trap was working. Emily noticed subtle differences around her. The same car no longer appeared outside her building. Her phone stopped ringing at night. The silence felt strange, almost suspicious. She still looked over her shoulder, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. She didn't know that Vincent had stationed quiet protection around her neighborhood. Marco's men followed her route each morning, ensuring no harm came close. Emily's world was beginning to stabilize, though she didn't yet trust the calm. Fear doesn't fade overnight. But for the first time in years, she began to feel the weight lifting. Frank visited Vincent again, bringing updates on the situation. The media had started digging into police misconduct cases from the past 5 years. It was only a matter of time before Hughes's name surfaced. Vincent remained calm, reviewing every article. He didn't need recognition or gratitude. He needed to know Emily was safe. He asked Marco to check her block again, making sure there were no signs of retaliation. Marco confirmed all was clear. Vincent nodded once, satisfied. Every move had gone according to plan, but he knew men like Hughes never went down quietly. Hughes began receiving calls from Internal Affairs. At first he denied everything, confident his uncle would protect him. But each call grew more serious. Anonymous tips kept arriving with new evidence, cash transfers, witness statements, even photos. He couldn't explain them. His uncle warned him to stay low, but panic was already setting in. He blamed Emily, convinced she had gone to someone for help. His obsession returned stronger than before. While his career burned, his hatred reignited. Vincent expected this. He told Marco to double Emily's protection. The fire was spreading, and soon the city would see it. Vincent's empire ran smoothly, but his focus remained on Hughes. He reviewed nightly reports like a general studying a battlefield. Marco's notes revealed that Hughes had withdrawn a large sum of cash, possibly preparing to flee. Vincent didn't plan to stop him yet. Running would make him look guilty, accelerating his downfall. He wanted the world to witness Hughes collapse publicly, not disappear quietly. Justice to Vincent wasn't just punishment, it was exposure. When a man's lies were stripped away in front of everyone, that was the true end. Hughes's day of exposure was getting closer. Emily continued showing up to work early, keeping her distance but performing flawlessly. Vincent admired her quiet resilience. She had no idea of the storm outside those office walls. He often wondered if she'd ever learn the truth of what he'd done for her, but decided it didn't matter. What mattered was peace returning to her life. Every bruise, every scar, every night she'd spent in fear, all of it would end because he refused to let injustice stand. In his own way, Vincent saw himself in her struggle. Power meant nothing if it didn't protect the innocent. By midweek, journalists published an article titled "Whispers in Blue: The Quiet Corruption Within Chicago's Finest." It detailed unnamed officers involved in illegal cash schemes. The story spread fast. While Hughes's name wasn't printed, anyone inside the department knew who the clues pointed toward. His uncle tried to contain the fallout, but pressure from the mayor's office grew. Hughes's calls went unanswered, his allies turned away. Vincent's plan was unfolding exactly as intended. The moment a corrupt man realizes he's alone, the destruction becomes self-inflicted. Fear turns inward, and no amount of denial can stop it. Hughes' drinking increased. Surveillance caught him stumbling out of bars, muttering to himself, furious at invisible enemies. He started driving aimlessly through the night, parking near Emily's street but never stepping out. Vincent watched those recordings in silence. The man was unraveling faster than expected. Marco suggested ending it soon, but Vincent shook his head. It wasn't time yet. The lesson had to last. The man who used to make a woman afraid to sleep should learn what sleeplessness felt like himself. Fear wasn't punishment, it was education. And Hughes was still in class. Internal Affairs launched a formal investigation, officially notifying Hughes. The badge that once shielded him now dragged him deeper into scrutiny. Vincent's influence was never direct, but his network ensured every step moved faster. Financial records appeared in inboxes. Witnesses came forward anonymously. By the end of the week, the inquiry was headline news. The department's silence confirmed the truth. Hughes tried to reach his uncle again, but his calls went to voicemail. Vincent watched the news broadcast from his office, calm and collected. The city was finally beginning to devour one of its own. Frank raised a concern. What if Hughes turned violent? Vincent had anticipated that outcome. Marco's team had weapons licensed through security contracts, all legally stationed near Emily's neighborhood. Every exit from her building was monitored. Hughes didn't know it yet, but he couldn't get near her even if he tried. Vincent made sure his protection looked like coincidence. Maintenance crews, food vendors, passing cars. No one would ever trace it back to him. His goal was order, not chaos. Justice that arrived quietly often stayed longer. The louder kind burned out too fast. Emily began smiling again. Small and uncertain but genuine. Mrs. Lane noticed and mentioned it to Vincent one afternoon. He didn't react outwardly, but his silence held satisfaction. The world had shifted slightly in her favor, and she didn't even know why. Vincent's mind was already moving ahead to the next step. The inquiry was open, but it needed weight, something undeniable. Marco reported a new lead. Hughes had used police resources to track Emily's phone location months ago. That detail would be fatal if exposed. Vincent leaned forward. That was the final crack he needed. Frank warned him again that involving digital evidence could draw federal attention, but Vincent didn't care. The goal was destruction, not convenience. They sent the records anonymously to an independent journalist known for covering abuse of power cases. The story hit within 48 hours. Screens across Chicago flashed headlines about a police officer accused of stalking his ex-wife using internal databases. Though unnamed, everyone recognized who it referred to. The department's silence confirmed it. Vincent watched from his office window as snow began to fall outside. Justice, cold and silent, was finally taking shape. Hughes' uncle summoned him for a private meeting, demanding he resign quietly to save what was left of the family's reputation. Hughes refused, furious, shouting that he was being framed. The argument was recorded by one of Marco's contacts. Vincent received the audio that night. The rage, the desperation, it was exactly what he wanted. A cornered man yelling at his own blood. The next morning, the recording was leaked online. The city listened as Hughes accused his uncle of betrayal. The corruption circle was breaking, and no one could tell who started it anymore. By now, Hughes was isolated completely. Friends gone, income frozen, reputation destroyed. His badge was suspended pending review. The story reached national coverage. Reporters camped outside the precinct. Neighbors whispered. Emily watched the news one morning and saw a blurred photo she recognized. Her hands shook as realization set in. She didn't understand how it all happened, but the fear that had lived inside her for years began to fade. For the first time, she wasn't the one being hunted. Somewhere in the city, someone had flipped the balance of power in her favor. Vincent knew what would come next. A man like Hughes wouldn't surrender easily. Desperation makes the dangerous unpredictable. he called Marco, and ordered a silent perimeter around Emily's apartment for the next 72 hours. Marco's men moved quietly, unmarked vehicles stationed nearby. Vincent didn't tell Emily. He wanted her unaware, safe inside the illusion of peace. Frank visited again that night, asking if it was worth all this risk. Vincent looked at the skyline, thinking of every woman he'd seen broken by men who thought fear was power. Yes, he said, some wars were personal. Hughes spent his nights driving through the city, paranoid and bitter. He called Emily again, leaving a voicemail that alternated between apologies and threats. Marco played it for Vincent. The tone was unhinged, a man spiraling between guilt and hatred. Vincent ordered the file preserved. It would be useful later. Emily never heard the message. Marco's men deleted it before it reached her phone. She slept peacefully that night, unaware of the car parked 3 blocks away, or the men watching it from the shadows. Every move was controlled, precise, like a game of silent chess. The following day, a reporter ambushed Hughes outside his building, asking about the allegations. The footage aired that evening. His anger exploded on camera. He shoved the reporter, cursed, and stormed away. The video spread instantly. Public opinion turned completely. The department suspended him indefinitely. His uncle released a statement calling for accountability. Vincent watched it all unfold from his office. The empire Hughes had built on arrogance was gone. The city that once ignored his cruelty now devoured him for it. Vincent didn't smile, but the quiet satisfaction in his eyes said everything. Emily noticed the difference in herself at work. Her hands no longer trembled. She laughed once in the hallway, surprising even Mrs. Lane. The change didn't go unnoticed by Vincent. He saw it as confirmation that his plan had worked. Hughes was finished, but the cleanup wasn't over yet. Marco informed him of loose ends, bank accounts, contacts, and a few lingering threats within the department. Vincent told him to seal every one. He wanted no trace of their involvement. Justice could never look like intervention. It had to feel like fate catching up with the guilty. Late one night, Marco entered Vincent's office with final confirmation. Hughes' suspension was now permanent pending charges. The department was collapsing under the weight of its own secrets. Vincent leaned back, the city lights reflecting in his glass. The job wasn't over, but the hardest part was done. He poured himself a drink, took a slow breath, and looked out at Chicago. Somewhere in the same city, Emily was finally free from fear, and somewhere else, Daniel Hughes sat alone, realizing he had picked the wrong man to cross. The storm had only one direction left to go. The days that followed brought calm to everyone except Daniel Hughes. His life had turned into a blur of legal calls, reporters, and sleepless nights. Emily, meanwhile, found small joys again: music on her way to work, sunlight through the bus window, moments that didn't feel borrowed from fear. Vincent kept his distance but continued to monitor her quietly. She didn't know the storm was still circling her name, or that her safety depended on the invisible threads Vincent controlled. Hughes was finished publicly, but broken men often sought revenge before accepting their ruin. Vincent knew it wasn't over. Marco updated him one morning, voice tense. Hughes had emptied his savings account. He was unpredictable now, possibly desperate. Vincent understood that desperation often made men dangerous. He ordered round-the-clock surveillance near Emily's apartment and new locks installed on her floor under the guise of maintenance. No one told her why. She didn't need to live with the burden of fear again. Vincent preferred her ignorance. It meant the system he built worked. He instructed Marco to be ready for anything. Hughes wouldn't vanish quietly. Men like him always needed a final act, and it was coming soon. Frank visited later that day, bringing with him whispers from within the department. Internal Affairs had compiled enough evidence to file formal charges. They would arrest Hughes within the week. Vincent listened quietly, knowing how unpredictable the final days before an arrest could become. He'd seen it before. Cornered men lashing out in ways no one expected. He ordered Marco not to intervene unless Emily was directly threatened. Patience was still part of the plan, but so was preparation. The hunt wasn't about speed anymore. It was about control, and every move from here had to be exact. Outside, winter deepened. Snow covered the city streets, muting sound and slowing time. Vincent sat by his window late at night, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the faint lights flickering across the skyline. For once, the silence didn't feel like calm. It felt like anticipation. Marco's daily reports became shorter, cleaner, like the calm before something breaks. Hughes had been seen near a gun store, asking questions. Vincent knew that look in a man's eyes. the kind that couldn't see past revenge. He didn't panic, he just adjusted the plan. The predator was now prey. Hughes's paranoia grew worse each hour. He convinced himself that Emily had turned everyone against him. He spent his nights driving through old neighborhoods trying to figure out who was watching. His reflection in the windshield looked less like a cop and more like a stranger. Marco's cameras captured him talking to himself, shouting in the empty car. Vincent reviewed the footage in silence. The descent was complete. Hughes was running on pure emotion now, and emotion made people sloppy. The time for subtlety was nearly over. Soon Hughes would make a mistake he couldn't recover from. The news exploded that week. A leaked report exposed years of internal cover-ups involving multiple officers. Every name in that circle faced suspension. Hughes's was the only one with criminal charges attached. Television anchors repeated his name endlessly. The press surrounded his apartment building, reporters shouting questions he refused to answer. The once respected officer had become the face of corruption. Vincent didn't celebrate. He didn't believe in victories, only closures. Still, he couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction that came with justice unfolding in real time. Emily's nightmare had become someone else's, and for once, it wasn't hers to endure. Marco met Vincent in his office the next morning. He confirmed that Hughes had gone completely off the grid. No phone activity, no credit card usage, no GPS signals. He was moving without leaving tracks. Vincent understood what that meant. Hughes was preparing for something final. He told Marco to keep watch, but not to intervene prematurely. Let Hughes feel invisible. It would make catching him easier. Vincent wasn't reckless. He didn't act until the odds favored him completely, but deep inside, he knew time was narrowing. There was always one last move before everything came to an end. Frank worried about blowback. Taking down a police officer had drawn quiet attention from higher authorities. He warned Vincent that keeping his involvement invisible was crucial now. Vincent nodded. Already aware, he'd spent a lifetime walking that line between justice and exposure. He told Frank that everything they'd done was clean. No evidence, no trails. The city would see Hughes's fall as internal failure, not outside interference. Frank still looked uneasy but trusted Vincent's judgment. Vincent had survived worse storms. He knew exactly how much light to allow before the truth stayed buried where it belonged. Emily noticed that the people around her treated her differently. Mrs. Lane smiled more. The security guards greeted her warmly. She didn't realize these gestures came from Vincent's quiet influence. Her confidence began returning slowly, though fear lingered in shadows of memory. Some nights she still woke, certain she'd heard footsteps outside. Each time it was only the wind, but the past doesn't vanish easily. Vincent knew that too. Healing wasn't immediate, it was gradual, like the thaw after winter. For now she was safe, and that was all that mattered. Hughes's chapter was closing soon. Marco called late one night with news. Hughes had been spotted again driving near the river district. He'd stopped at an old motel known for housing fugitives. Vincent gave the order to keep surveillance tight but silent. No contact, just watch. They tracked him through the night as he moved restlessly, pacing outside the building. Marco noted that Hughes seemed unstable, talking to himself, gripping his phone, deleting numbers. Vincent could see it clearly. Hughes wasn't planning escape, he was planning confrontation. The question wasn't if he would come for Emily, it was when, and Vincent was ready. The following morning, Frank entered Vincent's office to find him already standing by the window, waiting. Snow fell outside in quiet sheets, the city moving slowly beneath it. Vincent's intuition told him the day would bring something decisive. His instincts rarely failed him. Around noon, Marco called. Hughes had left the motel, alone, armed, heading toward the west side. Vincent didn't hesitate. He told Marco to follow but keep distance. The pieces were moving exactly as predicted. Fear, desperation, pride, all converging into one final mistake. By sunset, this story would end where it had begun, with Emily Carter. Emily left the office that evening as usual, unaware of the storm approaching. She smiled at Mrs. Lane, thanked the guard and walked into the cold air. Marco's men shadowed her at a distance, keeping her in sight without making contact. Hughes's car was already in motion, crawling through nearby streets. He muttered under his breath, rage mixed with tears, convincing himself she had ruined his life. He didn't know that every step he took was being tracked. Vincent watched the scene unfold through live footage on his office screen, eyes fixed, calm as the city darkened. As the evening deepened, Emily reached her bus stop. Snowflakes swirled around her, softening the streetlights. She didn't see the dark sedan approaching slowly from the other side. Marco's voice came through Vincent's speaker. "He's close." Vincent leaned forward. Every instinct in him sharpened. He gave a single command: "Don't move yet." He needed Hughes to reveal intent, to cross the line publicly. The evidence would be irrefutable. The car stopped briefly across the street, engine rumbling. Emily felt something, a cold awareness, but brushed it off. Hughes watched from behind the wheel, hand trembling on the gun resting beside him. The air was tense. Marco's team waited, eyes on their targets. Hughes finally opened his car door, stepping into the falling snow. He pulled up his collar and started crossing the street toward Emily. Marco asked for permission to intervene. Vincent hesitated only a second, then gave the word. The unmarked cars moved simultaneously, lights flashing briefly before cutting out. Hughes froze, realizing too late he wasn't alone. He reached for his weapon, but Marco's men surrounded him instantly. One command, firm and final, made him drop the gun. The quiet streets of Chicago witnessed his last act of defiance. The arrest was silent and efficient. Hughes shouted about conspiracies, insisting he was framed, but no one listened. Cameras from nearby shops captured everything: his rage, his fall, his humiliation. Vincent watched in silence as the scene unfolded live. Justice didn't always need a courtroom. Sometimes it arrived in snow-covered streets under dim lights. Marco confirmed the suspect was in custody. Vincent gave a quiet nod and closed the monitor. The job was done. There was no triumph in his expression, only resolve. He never celebrated vengeance. He only respected the balance when it was finally restored. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story: a disgraced officer arrested on corruption and harassment charges. The headlines spread like wildfire. Reporters called it Chicago's badge scandal. The footage of his arrest played on repeat across every channel. The public demanded reform. Politicians distanced themselves. Even the police union refused to defend him. Hughes's name had become poison. Vincent watched quietly, the city humming outside his window. This wasn't chaos. It was justice reorganizing itself. The man who once hid behind authority now faced the same system he had corrupted. Balance, though delayed, had finally returned. Emily woke to the news the next morning. Her phone buzzed with messages. Co-workers, friends, even her sister. She turned on the TV and saw his face plastered on every station. Former officer arrested in corruption probe. She covered her mouth, unable to breathe for a moment. It was over, truly over. The relief came slowly, almost painfully. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she realized she no longer had to look over her shoulder. Mrs. Lane hugged her when she arrived at work, whispering that it was finally done. Emily didn't know who to thank, only that she was free. Vincent entered the office later than usual, composed as always. Emily brought him coffee with steady hands. For the first time their eyes met properly. She smiled faintly, the kind that spoke gratitude without words. He returned the smile, brief but genuine. He didn't ask how she felt, and she didn't mention the news. Between them existed a silent understanding. Some debts didn't need to be spoken. Vincent turned his attention to his paperwork, the city returning to its rhythm. Yet deep down he knew something in both of them had quietly changed forever. Across the city, reporters continued dissecting the story. The department scrambled to rebuild trust, firing officers and issuing apologies. Vincent's name was never mentioned anywhere, just as he intended. Frank congratulated him privately, admitting the plan had been flawless. Vincent dismissed it with a quiet shake of his head. There was nothing to celebrate. The world didn't get better because one man fell. It only stayed balanced a little longer. Still, he couldn't deny a faint satisfaction when he thought of Emily's calm expression that morning. Peace was rare in his world. He intended to preserve it for her. That night, Hughes sat alone in a cell under bright fluorescent lights. The noise of distant footsteps echoed through the hallway. Reporters had moved on to other stories, but the silence in his head was louder than ever. For the first time, there was no one left to blame. He realized the power he'd abused had vanished completely. The same fear he once inflicted now wrapped around him. He remembered Emily's face, the way she'd looked at him the last time he'd spoken to her. That memory, once a symbol of control, now haunted him in reverse. Meanwhile, Marco finalized cleanup operations. All digital traces, leaks, and surveillance files were deleted or encrypted. No one could connect the operation to Vincent's network. Frank handled the final payments to contacts and informants, ensuring silence. The city had what it wanted: a villain to blame and a headline to close the story. Vincent's name remained absent from every record. It was how he preferred it. In his world, true influence meant leaving no fingerprints. Justice didn't need applause. It needed endurance. He looked at the skyline again that night, knowing he'd restored a small piece of balance. Emily's recovery continued quietly. She began taking short walks during lunch breaks, enjoying small freedoms she'd once denied herself. Mrs. Lane noticed how different she looked now, lighter, more alive. Vincent watched from a respectful distance, never intruding. He knew the value of space after pain. One afternoon, he saw her laughing with another employee, a sound that had been missing from the office for too long. For him, that was victory enough. In a city where fear ruled most lives, seeing someone find peace again was rarer than any empire he could build. The following week, Frank met Vincent to discuss other business matters, deals, logistics, and finances. All the usual. But midway through, he paused and asked Vincent a question. Why risk so much for someone who wasn't family? Vincent didn't answer right away. He stared at the glass of water in front of him, the reflection of city lights shifting across its surface. Finally, he said that Emily reminded him of someone he'd once failed to protect. That was all. Frank didn't ask again. Some ghosts didn't belong in words, only in the actions they inspired. Days turned into weeks. The city moved on to new scandals, new faces, new stories. Emily adjusted fully to her new life, free from the weight that once followed her. Vincent remained her employer, distant yet steady. Their paths now ran parallel, each aware of the unspoken thread that connected them. She didn't know the depth of what he'd done, and he preferred it that way. Power wasn't meant to be recognized. It was meant to be used quietly when it mattered. In that silence, Vincent found peace in a way he hadn't felt for years. Late one evening, Vincent stood by his office window, the city lights flickering against the glass. He thought of how close things had come to breaking, how easily one decision had rippled through so many lives. Behind him, the faint sound of Emily's laughter carried from the hallway. He closed his eyes, letting it sink in. The sound was rare, almost sacred. Justice wasn't about power or control, it was about balance restored, about silence reclaimed. And as the night deepened, Vincent finally allowed himself a quiet thought. Some wars end not with victory, but with peace. The news cycle moved on, but the echoes of Hughes's arrest lingered in Chicago's undercurrent. Inside the jail, he sat in silence most days, unshaven and hollow-eyed, replaying the downfall over and over. Every headline was a reminder of what he'd lost. But beneath that bitterness, something darker grew, a need to blame someone. Emily's name lived rent-free in his thoughts, festering like an old wound. He told himself if it wasn't for her, he'd still have his badge, his life, his control. That obsession, once fueled by dominance, was now driven purely by vengeance. He wanted her afraid again. Marco's men intercepted early whispers from inside the jail. Hughes had been overheard making threats, boasting about knowing people who could fix things once he was out. Vincent listened without reaction, but his silence carried weight. He ordered Marco to dig deeper, find out who Hughes still had contact with. Marco confirmed there were two names, an ex-officer recently fired, and a small-time enforcer from the South Side. Both owed Hughes favors. Vincent didn't underestimate desperate men. He told Marco to send quiet warnings through the right channels. Anyone helping Hughes would learn fear faster than loyalty. Emily continued her routine, unaware that her name still lived in the shadows. Work brought her comfort again. The office no longer felt heavy with tension. Some days she even caught herself humming softly while sorting papers. Vincent noticed, though he said nothing. Watching her rebuild herself brought an unfamiliar calm to his own life. For years he'd only destroyed things. Rivals, threats, obstacles. Protecting someone had reminded him. There was still a line between power and cruelty. He guarded that line now more fiercely than anything. And Emily's peace was proof it still existed. Frank joined Vincent one evening, carrying updates about other matters. But the conversation drifted back to Hughes. Frank mentioned that a lawyer was trying to appeal on Hughes's behalf, pushing for early release on technical grounds. Vincent set his glass down, expression unreadable. He told Frank to make sure the process faced delays. Frank understood. Legal systems were like clockwork. One broken gear could stop time indefinitely. By the next day, court dates vanished into backlogs. Hughes's name was buried beneath bureaucracy. Vincent didn't break rules. He just bent the world until justice stayed permanent. Inside the jail, Hughes's frustration boiled over. Letters went unanswered. Lawyers quit, contacts disappeared. His uncle had retired quietly, cutting all ties. Alone, he began to realize no one was coming to save him. That isolation was punishment greater than any sentence. Vincent believed in that kind of justice, the kind that didn't rely on violence but on silence. The same silence Hughes had once forced on Emily, now surrounded him completely. No calls, no visits, no power. For a man who thrived on control, the absence of it was a slow, precise execution. Months passed. The city healed quickly, as it always did after scandals. Emily's smile became part of the office routine. She even began volunteering at a shelter on weekends, quietly giving others the safety she had once lost. Vincent noticed this change from afar. He didn't involve himself but respected it deeply. He saw in her what he'd lost years ago, the ability to move forward without vengeance. For him, justice was structure. For her, it was freedom, and in that difference he found a strange balance. It was as if both had reclaimed something the other had lost. Marco continued to report regularly, confirming there were no more threats. Every loose end tied itself quietly under Vincent's command. The department avoided revisiting Hughes's case, fearing exposure. The city called it closure. Vincent called it maintenance. Justice, he believed, wasn't a one-time act. It was upkeep. It had to be watched, adjusted, protected. He spent his evenings ensuring that peace remained untouched. The world might never know what he'd done, but that wasn't important. His satisfaction came not from recognition, but from results. And Emily's peace of mind was the most valuable result of all. One evening, Vincent returned home to find a small envelope on his desk. Inside was a handwritten note from Emily. It was simple, just a few words. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how, but I know." No signature, no explanation, just quiet acknowledgement. Vincent read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his drawer. He didn't need her to know the details. Gratitude, like justice, was best when subtle. He poured himself a drink and looked out at the skyline, realizing for the first time in years that the city finally felt calm. Meanwhile, in his cell, Hughes sat awake one night, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights. He'd stopped talking to other inmates, stopped eating full meals, and stopped pretending he'd ever get out. The silence pressed against him until he began whispering to himself again. But this time, his words weren't angry, they were hollow. He mumbled Emily's name, asking why she'd done this to him. He still couldn't understand that he was the author of his own destruction. Power had blinded him, now it abandoned him. His reflection in the steel sink barely looked human anymore. Vincent's business empire continued as usual. Meetings, negotiations, and silent partnerships filled his days. But he found himself thinking more often about Emily's journey than his profits. Her resilience reminded him that strength wasn't always about control. It was about survival. He had built his life by mastering fear. She had survived hers by outlasting it. He realized he'd protected her not because she needed saving, but because she represented something he'd forgotten. Innocence still existed somewhere, even in a city as unforgiving as Chicago. That truth, more than power, was what kept him going now. Frank approached him with new opportunities. Territories, investments, alliances, but Vincent declined most of them. He was no longer chasing expansion. Power without purpose had lost its meaning. Frank noticed the change and said nothing. He'd seen men grow tired of war before, but never Vincent. This was different. It wasn't fatigue, it was clarity. Vincent had proved to himself that he could still choose right over easy. In a world ruled by fear and greed, that choice made him dangerous in a different way. He didn't need to be the loudest man in the room to control it. Emily's life continued to bloom quietly. She was promoted, earning the respect of everyone around her. Vincent made sure of it, though she never knew. He recommended her for the role under another manager, ensuring she could move forward without feeling indebted. Her laughter filled corners of the office that had once felt heavy. She began planning trips, talking about the future again. Every step she took reminded Vincent that peace wasn't something you demanded, it was something you built. She had done the hardest part herself. All he'd done was remove the weight keeping her from it. One afternoon, Vincent found himself staring at the empty chair across from his desk. It was where Emily used to sit before she moved offices. The silence felt heavier now, but not lonely. It was the silence of resolution. He realized how rare it was to end a story cleanly in his world. Usually everything left a stain, blood, regret, collateral, but this time was different. The ending was quiet, almost peaceful. That rarity made it precious. For once the city hadn't taken something from him, it had given something back. A reminder that even power could serve compassion. Frank entered the office with a small grin, carrying a newspaper. On the front page was a headline about police reforms inspired by the corruption case months earlier. New oversight committees, new accountability measures. Frank placed it on Vincent's desk saying, "You started this." Vincent didn't respond. He didn't believe in credit or praise. Change wasn't his goal. It was consequence. Still, as he glanced at the paper, he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. A ripple he'd caused had reached beyond one man's downfall. It had reshaped something larger, even if no one would ever know. Marco stopped by that evening with final confirmation. Hughes's appeal had been denied. He would serve his full sentence without parole. Vincent listened, then dismissed him with a nod. There was no satisfaction left to find in it. The story had ended long ago. Justice wasn't about watching a man suffer. It was about making sure his victims could live again. And Emily was living. That was enough. Marco left the room, leaving Vincent alone with his thoughts. The city outside was quiet, almost forgiving. For once it didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like closure. Emily sent one last email to Vincent a few weeks later, thanking him again for believing in her. She said she was moving to a new apartment and starting evening classes. She didn't mention Hughes, and Vincent didn't either. The past no longer belonged in their conversations. He replied simply, "You've earned your peace." She smiled at the message, unsure how much he knew, but grateful nonetheless. For both of them, that brief exchange marked the true ending, simple, clean, and final. Some debts, once paid, didn't need words to close. Silence was enough. As spring approached, the city thawed. Snow gave way to rain, and streets filled again with life. Vincent walked through the downtown streets one night, unnoticed among the crowd. He liked it that way. The anonymity reminded him of what he'd always wanted: to control the city from the shadows, not live in its light. But now the shadows didn't feel heavy, they felt earned. He had bent the darkness toward something good, however small. Maybe that was enough redemption for a man like him. He stopped at a corner, looked up, and smiled faintly at nothing in particular. Inside the jail, Hughes finally broke. One morning, guards found him silent in his bunk, eyes open but vacant. He hadn't spoken in days. The weight of isolation had done what justice never could. It hollowed him out completely. He wasn't dead, not physically, but something inside him was gone. The man who once ruled others through fear was now a ghost of himself, trapped in the same silence he had once forced upon others. Vincent never asked for updates again. He didn't need to. The world had taken care of the rest, exactly as he intended. Vincent began visiting his old haunts less frequently. The restaurants, clubs, and offices that once defined his empire felt irrelevant now. He preferred the quiet corners of the city, the docks, the rooftops, places where he could watch people live normal lives. Power had given him distance, but this view reminded him what it was for. Protecting people didn't make him weak. It made him human again. For years he'd feared losing his edge. Now he realized compassion hadn't dulled it. It had sharpened it into something stronger. Fear ruled empires, but empathy rebuilt them. One night, Vincent stood at his penthouse balcony, the wind cutting cold against his face. Below him, the city pulsed with life, lights, sirens, stories intertwining in endless rhythm. He thought about everything that had happened. Justice, revenge, redemption. They all looked the same when viewed from above. What mattered wasn't what people called it, but the peace it left behind. He raised his glass slightly toward the skyline, a silent toast to the balance he'd restored. For once, he didn't feel like a ruler looking down on his city. He felt like part of it again. Frank arrived the next morning with paperwork for new deals, but Vincent barely glanced at them. He wasn't chasing expansion anymore. Instead, he asked Frank to increase donations to local shelters and women's programs under one of his front charities. Frank raised an eyebrow, surprised, but didn't question it. Vincent didn't explain himself. He just said, "It's good business." The truth was simpler. He'd seen what happened when power ignored pain. He couldn't change the world, but he could tilt the scale slightly toward fairness. It wasn't kindness. It was maintenance of the balance he believed in. Emily flourished in her new life. Her confidence grew, and her laughter became effortless. She occasionally thought about her old job and the quiet man who'd always watched over her. She never learned the full truth, but sometimes she suspected. When she passed his office for the last time, she paused, smiled faintly, and whispered a quiet thank you under her breath. It was enough. she didn't need to say more. Some people enter your life to break its darkness, even if you never know their names. Vincent had been that light, and she felt it still. As months passed, rumors began circulating about Vincent's softer side. Rivals whispered that he'd gone weak, distracted. They mistook compassion for vulnerability. Frank and Marco knew better. Vincent hadn't lost his edge. He'd refined it. When smaller gangs tested his patience, his response was still decisive, swift, silent, final. But his reasons had changed. Violence wasn't his first language anymore. He had learned something more effective: control through fear when needed, and mercy when earned. The city still feared him, but now it respected him too. That balance was rare, and Vincent intended to keep it. Frank occasionally teased him, calling him the city's silent guardian. Vincent brushed it off with a smirk, but the words stayed with him. Guardian. It wasn't how he saw himself, but maybe that was what he had become. Not a savior, not a saint, just a man who made sure evil met consequence. That was enough. The world didn't need heroes. It needed men willing to act when others turned away. Vincent had become that man, even if no one would ever know it, and in the quiet corners of Chicago, peace endured because of it. The night ended with Vincent back at his office, the skyline glowing faintly beyond the glass. He reached into his drawer and unfolded Emily's note again. The paper was worn, edges soft from being read too many times. He placed it on the desk, beside his glass, and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, his mind felt still. Outside, the city continued moving, unaware of the quiet war that had been fought within it. Vincent smiled faintly. Justice didn't need witnesses. It only needed someone willing to see it through to the end. The years began to move quietly. The scandal faded into history, becoming just another story the city forgot. Vincent aged into his silence, running his empire with efficiency and calm. Yet sometimes, late at night, he caught himself thinking about Emily's laughter, the way it had filled his office like sunlight through blinds. He wondered if she still remembered him, or if her life had finally drifted far enough from the darkness that she no longer needed to. The thought brought peace, not sadness. She had escaped his world. That was what he had wanted all along. Frank visited less frequently now, content that the business ran itself. Marco had taken over much of the daily work, leaving Vincent with time he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He spent it walking the city's quieter streets, the ones unmarked by luxury or danger. Shopkeepers greeted him without knowing who he was. Children ran past without fear. For once, he was invisible in the best way possible. It reminded him that control wasn't about being seen. It was about knowing you'd left something better behind. Chicago, chaotic and flawed, felt almost human again. One rainy afternoon, Vincent stopped by a cafe he'd never entered before. As he waited for his coffee, a familiar voice reached him from across the counter. Emily. She was older now, more confident, her hair shorter but her eyes the same. She didn't notice him at first. She was helping a young intern with an assignment, patient and kind. He watched quietly, not wanting to interrupt her peace. Seeing her living freely, smiling without shadows, was enough. The girl who once hid her bruises now guided others toward strength. Vincent left without saying a word. Walking back into the rain, Vincent felt something loosen inside him. For years he had carried the weight of others' pain, fixing things from the dark, never expecting gratitude. But seeing Emily living fully reminded him that some victories didn't belong to him, they belonged to those who survived. He stopped under an awning, and let the rain hit his coat. The city moved on around him, uncaring, alive. He smiled faintly, realizing that for the first time in decades, he didn't feel like the man cleaning up the world's mess. He just felt human again. That night, Vincent returned home to find Marco waiting with news. Hughes had died quietly in prison, no violence, no event, just a man whose heart stopped after years of silence. Marco asked if he should handle the press inquiries, but Vincent waved it off. There was nothing to handle. Some stories ended themselves. He poured a drink and sat in the dim light, remembering every step that had brought them here. Hughes's death wasn't triumph or closure, it was simply consequence. Justice had run its course. The past no longer demanded anything from him. It was over. Frank called later that week to tell him the city planned to name a new initiative after the corruption reforms. Vincent listened but didn't respond. Awards and recognition meant nothing to him. He hung up politely, then returned to his balcony. The wind carried the sound of distant sirens, a lullaby of the city he'd shaped quietly from the shadows. He had given it order, balance, and a chance to heal. That was enough. He didn't need history to remember him. He only needed to know that when he left, chaos wouldn't fill the void he'd once ruled. Emily's name appeared in the news again months later. She'd been promoted to director of a nonprofit advocating for abuse victims. Vincent read the article slowly, smiling as he took in her photo. She looked strong, alive, and utterly free. That single image felt like the final chapter he'd been waiting for. He clipped the article and tucked it beside her note in his drawer. He didn't need to see her again. Her happiness was the proof his work had meant something. Sometimes justice didn't echo. It simply rippled outward through the lives it had quietly saved. Vincent began stepping back from business. Marco and Frank managed most affairs, though they still deferred to him for final decisions. He preferred it that way, guiding from a distance, rarely appearing in public. The younger men saw him as a relic, but one they respected. He let them think that. He'd spent decades building an empire strong enough to survive without him. Now it was time to let it breathe. His presence had always cast a long shadow. Perhaps it was time to let the next generation walk in the light, unafraid of what stood behind them. One evening, as dusk turned the sky amber, Vincent walked through his old neighborhood. The buildings had changed, but the rhythm hadn't. He passed the church steps where he'd once made his first deal, the alley where he'd once spilled blood to prove loyalty. Each corner held a memory of who he used to be. He didn't regret those choices. They had built his life, but he understood now that survival had never been the goal, living had been. He paused at the end of the block, breathing in the faint scent of bread from a nearby bakery. Life continued. Marco joined him on that walk, keeping quiet beside him. After a while he asked Vincent if he'd ever thought about leaving Chicago. Vincent chuckled softly. "No," he said. "The city doesn't need me to leave. It just needs me to stop controlling it." Marco nodded, understanding more than the words said. They walked in silence again, the kind of silence that came when there was nothing left to prove. Vincent looked around at the city lights flickering to life, and felt something unfamiliar, contentment. For once the night didn't feel heavy. It simply existed. Weeks passed, uneventful and calm. Vincent's world had grown smaller, simpler. He spent mornings reading, evenings watching the skyline. The phone still rang often, but he answered less. His life had been built on decisions that shaped others' fates. Now he wanted none of that. He found peace in the quiet routine, in the way the city lights turned gold against the windows at dusk. The empire no longer demanded his hands. For the first time in a lifetime, Vincent Moreau belonged to himself, and it was strange how heavy freedom felt after years of control. Frank noticed the change and came by one evening with a bottle of bourbon. They sat in silence for a while before Frank asked, "What now?" Vincent smiled faintly. "Now nothing," he said. "I think I've done enough moving pieces." Frank raised his glass in agreement. The two men drank without words, watching the night deepen beyond the windows. There were no enemies left, no wars to fight, no debts to settle. Just the hum of the city they'd shaped, still alive, still flawed, still theirs. It was a quiet ending, but it was the right one. Emily's foundation began expanding, opening new offices across neighboring states. Each time Vincent saw her name in a newspaper, or heard it on the radio, he felt a warmth that surprised him. Not pride. Something simpler, quieter. It reminded him that small acts could echo far longer than power ever did. The world rarely remembered who started the change. It only remembered the ones who carried it forward. She was doing that now. Vincent had planted the seed, but she had turned it into a forest. That realization gave him more peace than any deal or fortune ever could. One night, as rain tapped against his window, Vincent revisited the box in his drawer. Inside were few items. Emily's note, the newspaper clipping, an old photograph of him and Frank from their early days. He looked at them one by one, each piece representing a lifetime of choices. None were trophies. They were reminders. He had done terrible things for power, necessary things for survival, but one good thing out of conviction, and somehow, that single act had outweighed a lifetime of sins. Redemption wasn't loud. It was quiet, fragile, and easy to miss if you weren't looking. As years blended together, Vincent's hair turned silver, his movements slower, but his mind remained sharp. He no longer attended meetings, only sent brief notes when needed. Marco had become the face of their organization, with Frank as the steady hand behind it. Vincent watched proudly as they balanced profit with restraint. He'd built wolves who'd learned to protect rather than devour. That, he realized, was legacy, not the empire itself, but the evolution of those who inherited it. The cycle of fear had finally broken, and the city, once poisoned by power, was breathing again. Every so often, Vincent still received anonymous letters, victims from Emily's organization, thanking whoever had funded their shelter renovations. He never signed his name on donations, but somehow gratitude still found him. He kept each letter neatly stacked in his drawer beside her note. Some days he read them, other days he didn't. They were his quiet confessions, written by strangers who would never know who to thank. And that was enough. He didn't need the world to see the man he'd become. The few who mattered already lived better because he had changed. That was justice fulfilled. One evening, Vincent received a message from Frank. Emily wanted to meet him. She'd learned he was the anonymous donor behind several projects. Vincent hesitated. He wasn't sure what she expected to find, the savior or the sinner. Still, he agreed. The meeting was set for a small park near the river. At sunset, when he arrived, she was already there, holding a coffee cup, smiling warmly. There was no fear, no hesitation, only gratitude. "You didn't have to," she said. Vincent replied softly, "Neither did you." It wasn't an apology or forgiveness. It was understanding, finally spoken aloud. They sat on a bench overlooking the river, watching the water catch the light. Emily spoke about her work, her journey, her healing. Vincent listened, saying little. When she thanked him again, he shook his head. "You did this yourself," he said. "I only made sure the world didn't stop you." She smiled, her eyes glistening faintly. Sometimes that's all someone needs. The simplicity of her words struck him harder than any confession could. It wasn't about saving her. It was about believing she was worth saving. That belief had changed them both. When they parted, Emily hugged him briefly, an embrace that felt both final and forgiving. Vincent watched her walk away through the golden haze of sunset, her silhouette fading into the crowd. For a moment he stood frozen, realizing that this was the true end. Not revenge, not justice, but peace, earned, shared, complete. He turned back toward the river and took a slow breath. The city hummed softly behind him, alive as ever. He'd spent decades shaping it with iron hands. Now finally he was ready to let it shape him back. That night Vincent returned to his penthouse and poured a single drink. He didn't toast to anything or anyone. He simply sat there, listening to the faint sounds of rain and traffic below. His life had been built on power, but it ended on stillness. In that stillness he found clarity. The ghosts that had once haunted him, the choices, the violence, the loss, all seemed quieter now. Maybe redemption wasn't about forgiveness from others, but peace within yourself. And in that silence, Vincent Moreau finally understood that he had already earned it. Weeks later, Vincent fell ill briefly, a quiet reminder of age. Marco and Frank visited often, checking in, but he waved off concern. He'd lived his life on borrowed time. He didn't fear the end. Instead, he asked Marco to promise something simple: keep it balanced. Whatever happens, don't let the city slip. Marco promised without hesitation. Vincent nodded, satisfied. The empire would outlive him, but not in the way most empires did. This one would endure through restraint, through fairness. That was the legacy he wanted. No statues, no monuments, just balance that never broke again. On a quiet morning, Vincent sat by his window watching the city wake. Sunlight stretched across the skyline, catching the river like molten glass. He felt tired but content. Everything was in place. Emily's organization thrived. His men had grown into wiser versions of themselves. Chicago still buzzed with its usual chaos, but beneath it all ran the quiet order he'd left behind. He smiled faintly, realizing that, for the first time, he didn't need to fix anything. The city could stand on its own now. His war was over. Peace didn't need him anymore. That afternoon, Frank stopped by one last time. They talked for hours about old times, mistakes and victories. As evening came, Frank asked if Vincent ever regretted anything. Vincent thought for a long moment before answering. "Only the years I spent believing fear was power. Turns out, peace takes more strength." Frank nodded, emotion in his eyes, and poured them both a final drink. They clinked glasses in quiet respect. No words of goodbye were needed. Some friendships ended the same way they began, in loyalty and silence. That night, Vincent sat alone as the city lights flickered one by one. His eyes wandered to the drawer beside him. He opened it, took out Emily's note, and read it once more. "I don't know how, but I know." He smiled faintly, folded it back, and closed his eyes. Outside, the wind swept across the river, carrying the hum of a city finally at peace. Somewhere far below, life went on. And for the first time in a long time, so did Vincent's soul, quietly, gently, without fear or burden. The next morning, the sun rose over Chicago, warm and unbroken. Marco found Vincent in his chair by the window, a faint smile still on his face, the city reflected in his eyes. There was no drama, no spectacle, just stillness. News of his passing never reached headlines. The empire continued, steady, balanced, just as he'd designed it. Emily paused that morning during a meeting, feeling an inexplicable calm wash over her. Somewhere deep inside, she knew, justice had long been served, now peace had followed. And in the heart of the city, Vincent Moreau finally rested.